security, and this is the long postponed panel on a new Cold War with an emphasis on the question mark, because some people gave us grief this afternoon about even suggesting that there could possibly be a return to the Cold War. Hence the emphasis on the question mark. This panel has been in gestation for quite some time for a whole variety of reasons which I shall not entertain you with, but I'm delighted that my colleagues could join us tonight, and Dean Feinstein, the founding director of the School of Global and International Studies, will introduce them in a moment. But I particularly wanted to thank my colleague Tim Helwig, who directs the Center on Western Europe, and my colleague Sarah Phillips, who directs the Center on the Russian and East European Institute, who have been co-sponsors of this event, and their staff, who have worked in an unstinted fashion over a matter of several months, including my own, not to neglect the staff of my center, to make this come to fruition. And I'm delighted that we have a nice turnout on one of what almost is beginning to resemble the spring day. But without any further ado, we're going to turn to the panel. I am not going to provide an elaborate introduction to Dean Feinstein, who really doesn't need any introduction to this audience, having been here now almost a year.
Almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years, I stand corrected. But he has held a number of important positions in government in the past, including as the ambassador to Poland, and he has also worked at one of my favorite institutions, the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., as well as the Brookings Institution, another noted foreign policy think tank. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn the panel over to Dean Feinstein, who will introduce the panelists and briefly discuss what they are going to focus on in the course of the next hour or so. Thank you again, Dean, for doing this.
It's my pleasure. Shumi, thank you very much for organizing this panel. And welcome to all of you. Those of you who haven't been here, you're at the School of Global and International Studies. We opened this beautiful building in August. Secretary Kerry came here to inaugurate the building in October. And behind you is a beautiful wall of stones which connects the limestone and quarry tradition of Indiana University to the rest of the world and evokes the General Assembly of the United Nations. And I'm really delighted that my colleagues in Euro, Tim Helwig, and in REEI, Sarah Phillips, could join with Shumi to sponsor this. Thanks very much. And they're both doing tremendous jobs in both of their institutes, which are as important as they ever were. Before I introduce my colleagues, all of them are old friends, I wanted to just say a few framing remarks. So, as Professor Ganguly said, the subject of the talk is a new Cold War. And is there a new Cold War between Russia and the United States? And I guess before you can answer the question, we need to examine what is it that we mean by a Cold War. Is it just a shorthand to indicate poor relations between the United States and Russia? Or is it a more profound point? Is it a point about a return to ideological competition, an arms race, rival economic models, proxy wars, or some combination? Whether or not relations are getting worse, or whether or not we mean this in a more profound way, just a few obvious structural differences. If you go back to the period of the Cold War, between, let's just say, the mid-1980s, there were about 300,000 U.S. troops deployed in Europe to deter an attack by the Soviet-occupied East Bloc. There were also some 4,600 U.S. tactical nuclear weapons deployed in countries throughout NATO, with the Soviet Union having many more deployed west of the Ural Mountains and in countries throughout the Warsaw Pact. Clearly, we're not in that situation, and that's a good thing. But what can definitely be said is that relations between the United States and Russia are certainly, in my judgment, at their worst point since the end of the Cold War. And that was not the intention of the present U.S. administration. And as you may remember, in 2009, the Obama administration announced the start of a new policy called the reset. By the way, improperly translated into Russian, but maybe that was a sign of things to come. The reset wasn't designed principally to improve relations between the United States and Russia. The reset was aimed at making relations between the two countries more productive. And this is an important distinction. The United States sought to have a relationship with Russia which would produce better outcomes in areas of strategic importance to the United States. For example, in Afghanistan, or on nuclear arms control. There were some examples in which the reset had been successful, and our panelists, I'm sure, will talk about some of those. But the reset for sure ended effectively when Vladimir Putin reassumed the Russian presidency in 2012. And relations hit a new low following Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine, beginning in 2013 and continuing to this day. This produced a surprising unified response between the United States and Europe in terms of a series of surprisingly far-reaching sanctions against individuals and entities in Russia, and the pre-positioning of military equipment by the United States in some countries where previously there had not been major military assets, including in the Baltics and in Poland. And of course, this was followed by allegations of espionage and cyber attacks, not to mention the decision to grant asylum to Edward Snowden, the removal of Russia from the G8, which is once again the G7, the decision of Western leaders, which now seems long ago, not to attend the Winter Olympics in Sochi. And now the headlines are in Syria, Russia's entry into the war in Syria, propping up Bashar al-Assad, who the United States has said at various times needs to go, the bombing of Western-backed rebel groups in Syria, regular incursions into Turkish airspace. All of these have substantially increased tensions and risks between the two countries. The latest news is that the ceasefire between Syria, in Syria, seems to be holding, and a question that I'm sure we'll discuss today is the degree to which this might reflect some change in strategy by Putin, and whether Putin believes that in mitigating, easing, or stopping the mass migration of refugees into Europe, he might be able, as a consequence, to ease sanctions on Russia, which have had serious consequences for the Russian economy, magnified by the persistence of low energy prices. So, just a joke, a friend of mine said to me yesterday on the phone from Washington, people say Putin isn't a strategist, and he then paused and said, could have fooled me. So we'll talk about that now, beginning with Professor Sean Kay from Ohio Wesleyan University, and he'll be talking about the U.S. perspective on Russian-American relations. Professor Kay specializes in international politics, security, organizations, and foreign policy. He's the director of the Arneson Institute for Practical Politics and Public Affairs and chair of international studies at Ohio Wesleyan University. He's also worked in the Department of Defense on U.S.-Russian relations, NATO, and politics in the Balkans. Professor Kay's most recent book is America's Search for Security, the Triumph of Idealism, and the Return to Roots.
Sean, it's over to you.
All right, great, thanks. We're going to try to keep our talks really brief so we can open up discussion. But just thank you, Ambassador, not only for your service here to the students, but also to the country during your time in Poland. And thank you, Shani, also for hosting us and everyone. Like I said, I want to be fairly brief here. If there's a central argument I would make, first of all, I would say I think the question is, if we're going to look at the Cold War, we should look really carefully at how it ended, because that's where we need to be. Okay, we can just skip all the bad stuff and let's go right to the end. And there are ways I think that that can be accomplished. In effect, if there's a larger crossroads here, I think it's the tension between about a 20-year process of America's vision of liberal order building in Europe, kind of running right into classic great power politics. And what's surprising to me is how much in the last couple of decades we sort of lost our ability to think in terms of how great powers think. We did a lot of good job during the 90s explaining to Russia what their interests ought to be, and not a lot of time listening to what the Russians were saying they were thinking. And we failed to understand, I think, how deeply internalized the kind of attributes of Putinism had become even before Putin even got there. I mean, Yeltsin consolidated a lot of authority. He threatened Eastern Europe with maps from his MOD with nuclear bombs going off if NATO enlargement happened. And so there's a lot of posturing, but we always dismissed it and said, well, it's just for domestic politics. But the fact is that external environment was part of the dynamic that Russia failed to find a way to integrate into during the 1990s and 2000s, especially when given many opportunities to cooperate with NATO, to cooperate on missile defense and things like that. They sort of missed a number of opportunities. At the same time, if we look at the Cold War very quickly, a couple things are important to point out. For one thing, at the origins of the Cold War, people like George Kennan warned quite a bit that we should be very careful not to encircle Russia. And you don't need a PhD in Russian history to know that they don't react kindly to encirclement. And so that was kind of an obvious thing, and he was concerned about it at the time. But at the end of the day, NATO came about, and of course we ended up in the Cold War. But of course, as you know, our strategy was defensive in orientation. Okay, so we did see a shift, not right with the end of the Cold War though, because we did see a model for how to engage. It actually started with the Reagan administration by talking with Gorbachev, as Secretary of Defense Gates has argued. For about 6 years, the U.S. and the Russians kind of had almost a quasi-alliance at the top of world politics, a mutually advantageous relationship of winding down the Cold War with mutual respect and so on. Reagan in particular tried to signal that we will not take advantages of your weakness. He wanted to reciprocate in kind. If they made steps that were positive, they'd be rewarded. The George H.W. Bush administration masterfully, I think, handled the integration of Germany into the NATO alliance also. That was important, and that was something at the end of the day the Russians were relatively okay with. But then in the 90s and 2000s, we see a shift. And to focus very briefly on that, I would say the shift basically reflects what I argue is the rise of sort of a liberal interventionist and then neoconservative sort of loose consensus of worldview. And the vision was, let's make Europe whole and free. And it was a benign one. There's no question about it. And it had positive effects for integrating Poland and other countries. Even for Poland, serving as a bridge, for example, with more confidence to a new Russia, that was a helpful thing. But it is the case in 1996, the United States articulated a new strategy, which, for lack of, just to summarize very briefly, it specifically said that we want to enlarge the community of nations and free democracies, especially in areas of, quote, greatest strategic interest, as in Central and Eastern Europe and in the former new independent states of the former Soviet Union. Now, that may be true or not true, but that kind of happened, and there wasn't a lot of debate about that at the time. But this was a kind of a radical departure for how America conceived of its geopolitics. I mean, Eisenhower didn't get involved in 1956 in Hungary. 1968, the Prague Spring, and things like that. Because, of course, the structural effects of nuclear weapons at the end of the day, and the balance of power in Europe. But with the Soviets gone, we were able to move that forward. Now, I'm not one that will argue that the NATO enlargement thing is the cause of this. I will argue, however, that in fact the first round, the second round, probably did more to bring Russia in some cooperative metrics. But there's no question as we went further, they began to more and more internalize this idea that we had broke the bargain that ended the Cold War. Now, that's certainly not to say that, that's a different case to make as we try to understand the Russians than it is to say NATO enlargement, for example, is the taproot cause of this. However, I think you can talk about the first two rounds separately, but when in 2008, the United States pushed through the NATO alliance, a declaration at Bucharest that declared that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually be members of NATO. That was crossing a line that we were not prepared to back up. Ukrainians weren't even in favor of this at the time. And the effects were clear. It damaged our relations on Iran. Russia went into Georgia. That's why we needed a reboot, in effect. But this 2008 declaration, which still is official NATO policy, I should tell you, although the member states have a say in that. But if we talk about spreading moral values and things like that, it was a false promise to lead Ukraine to think that we were serious about actually doing that. And it did create unnecessary costs, clearly with Russia, as we walked right past them into a place that they had long identified as vital to their interests. Any Russian president would probably have a difficult time with the idea of Crimea as a NATO base, for example. Okay, so that I think is the place where it's worth focusing on. Russia but that said, the taproot of the problem here, as Ambassador Feinstein said, is what Russia decided to do when it went into Ukraine and illegally seized Crimea. Right? Now, does that necessitate a new Cold War? I think not. And I think the reason is because President Obama has, I think he's pretty close to the Goldilocks formula and how we needed to respond to this. And let me say what I mean by that. The core concern is how do you signal political, economic pain to Russia, but how do you also not exacerbate Putin's narrative about the West and its intentions and create the security dilemma, again, in particular, by things like arming Ukraine, for example. So we have acted, I would argue, with a pretty good balance of political, economic, and then military reassurance to the East European allies, at least as far as can go, without necessarily triggering further conflict. So that's the dilemma, and I do believe the President has gotten that well. Also, in terms of response, I would say he's gotten it pretty well in terms of how we look at burden sharing within NATO, but that's something else we can come back to. So I want to conclude my very short remarks here by saying that, first of all, is there a new Cold War? Well, I sure hope not, because we can't afford it. And secondly, we also can't afford it because there are places, obviously, that we can't succeed with things we want without the Russians. As we heard before, we've got issues in Afghanistan, North Korea, Iran, Syria, climate change, etc. And also, I would say, if they really do end up in a new Cold War, the structure of the balance of power overwhelmingly favors the West. I mean, we're talking about, between the U.S. and its European allies collectively, 1.2 trillion or so spent on defense, the largest economies in the world. Russia has a tanking economy and an alliance based on a flash mob in eastern Ukraine, Belarus, and Bashar al-Assad. So I'm not too worried about it. But they are doing things that are dangerous with flights of planes and things like that, nuclear aircraft, provocative things, and it's not helpful. And but they're trying, I think, and this will be my second to last point, to create a perception of strength when in fact they have lost Ukraine and Russia is weak. They are overstretched in Syria, and that I think is also why they're looking for a bargain of some kind. So finally, there are principles, I think, that could shape a policy going forward, and I'll just say this for 30 seconds. What do we need? We need to get kind of basic. We need good judgment. Rushing to arm Ukraine, in my opinion, would not have been good judgment. It would have put American military presence and training and equipment 300 miles from Moscow. Okay, not good judgment in that sense. Restraint shows that it can be effective if done well, as can engagement. Diplomacy is the key here. But we do need to reassure our allies, and we do need to, at the end of the day, also remember we have major other global priorities, including, especially, with the other Cold War with China. So we need to think about the Asia pivot in particular in this context, and I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are fascinating remarks, and I'm particularly intrigued by this, I don't know if I could say the similarities, but some overlap in approach in terms of restraint that you signaled during the Reagan years and the Obama years, which I think is an interesting point for our students to think about and all of us to contemplate. Thank you. And now Professor Rajan Menon will talk a little bit about the framework, the theoretical framework of what constitutes or what might constitute the return to the Cold War, and then as well to talk about this from a Russian perspective. Professor Menon holds the Ann and Bernard Spitzer Chair in Political Science at City College of New York, and is a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute for War and Peace at Columbia University, and the author of a new book, Conflict in Ukraine, Unwinding the Post-Cold War Order. Raj, thank you.
I think I'll stand so I can see all of you. Can you hear me okay? Yes? No? Oh, it's really bad.
Well done.
What if I come out here? Can you hear me now? Yeah? Okay. Lee, thank you very much. Shumit, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you who put this together. I have about 10 minutes. I'll try to stick pretty close to 10 minutes. There's a question on the board. Is this a new Cold War? And I know that Shumit and Lee put it as a question that we ought to talk about. They're not asserting that there is a new Cold War. Very briefly, I will tell you that I find it, as an analogy, the Cold War, as a historical analogy, misleading. As a concept for understanding the current international order, incoherent. And as a policy paradigm, absolutely pernicious. Beyond that, I have no strong feelings. Why do I think this way? It is because during the days of the Cold War, when Lee and Shumit and John and all of us cut our teeth, we had a very specific meaning for what we meant by it. And if there's one thing that we need to do in social science, at least we need to have our concepts clear. We meant that there was a bipolar world order, not in the psychiatric sense of the word, but a world order in which there were two powers that had overweening military superiority. That was one thing. Second, that they had two alliances, rather like Athens and Sparta, that spanned the critical part of the world, that is Eurasia, and subsidiary alliances in other parts of the world, so that pretty much everyone was spoken for in terms of who stood with whom. There was a strategic competition that was universal in scope, from Africa in the west to Vietnam in the east. And last but not least, there was an ideological model. The Soviet model may have run aground by the time the regime collapsed, but there was a very different presentation or answer to the question, how shall we organize ourselves as an economy, polity, and society? And I would say none of that exists at the moment. So let's look, for example, at the bipolar world order. And some of this Sean has touched on. So if you look at gross domestic product using PPP rather than currency conversion, because weird things happen if you use currency conversion, we have a GDP of something like $18 trillion, right? The Russian GDP is about 3.5 trillion. That's about 20% of ours. Our defense budget is about 600 billion, give or take, depending again on what figures you look at. Russia is about 51.6. It's about 10%. Let's use another indicator, foreign direct investment. It tells you something about how robust investors think an economy is, whether it's a good place for money. Our cumulative FDI, foreign direct investment, is about 3.4 trillion. Russia's is about 557 billion. That is equivalent to Belgium that has a population of 11 million as opposed to 147 million for Russia, and less than Singapore that has a population of something like 4 million. World trade, the top world trader at the moment is China, about 2.4 trillion. Russia has about 450 billion. It is also a hydrocarbon economy, which is to say oil prices having gone from $110 a barrel last year about this time to about 28 now. They are in serious trouble. Their economy is in recession. It's about 3.5% drop last year, expected to be more this year. Why is that? 50% of the budget, 50% of all revenues come from one sector, oil and gas. Another 10% from arms. Ain't much left after that. And they did not do anything during the period of high gas price and oil prices to revamp the economy. That is a classic pathology of hydrocarbon economies. So there isn't much economic and military oomph for a Cold War-like competition with the United States. Now, I'm not a big believer in soft power, but let me say, neither should we. I'll say a little word about that. I don't see, and in this sense Frank Fukuyama is right, I don't see the Russians posing any alternative to liberal democracy that has any purchase, with the possible exception of Viktor Orban's Hungary. Beyond that, I know of no one who feels that this is a political order and an economic order that is worth emulating. Let's take a look at something like corruption, which is a kind of a soft power element. The less you have, the more you can project yourself as a well-governed society. Where does Russia rank in Transparency International survey of 176 countries? 145th, tying Nigeria, which is the poster child for corruption. People talk about corruption in India. It's a very serious problem. India is about 85th, right? So I don't buy this business of the Cold War. Does it mean that we're in a benign phase? By no means. I think there are two crises that have taken us where we are today. One is Ukraine, and the other is Syria. And I assume you have background on this. If you don't, we can talk about it. But in the interest of time, I'll just say something very brief. I am an optimist on both in the following sense. I do not think Mr. Putin will start another war in Ukraine for two reasons. The seizure of Crimea, although it surprised everybody, including me, I didn't predict it, it caught me completely by surprise, was an easy thing for him to do because it is Ukraine's only ethnically Russian majority province, the only one. The Donbass, unlike what most people think, is not Russian majority. They had thousands of servicemen there. They doubtless had a plan in place. They could take that. I think when the referendum, flagrantly unconstitutional as per Ukraine's constitution, I might add, occurred, I don't think Putin expected these two self-proclaimed republics to suddenly turn up. I did think that would happen, having studied Ukraine for a while. He showed that although he did not expect them to arise, that he's prepared to defend them. This goes to Sean's point about arming Ukraine. We have to be very careful. Let me take you back to the summer of 2014. The Ukrainian army, such as it was, and a gaggle of militias, private militias armed by various warlords and oligarchs, was advancing into rebel-held territory in the Donbass. And a friend of mine, who's something of a Ukrainian nationalist, said, game's up. The government is going to unify Ukraine as a country, and the Russian Republic, the Russian-supported republics are going to be issued. There was a massive Russian escalation, first a push westward, and then something that's completely surprising, a drop downward across the Sea of Azov, moving toward the city of Mariupol. People thought that they were going to create a land bridge. There was a devastating destruction of the Ukrainian army in the town of Davidson in February of 2015, which shows one thing. Crimea is not coming back to Ukraine. It's not going to happen. The rebel republics, I'm less sure about, but any attempt by the Kiev government to liquidate them will create an escalation, and we are kidding ourselves if we think we can arm a Ukrainian army and not expect the Russians to up the ante. We had better be prepared for, are we prepared to take the next step? What does Mr. Putin want? I think he realizes the state of the economy. He's not foolish. Maybe diabolical, but he's not foolish. I think he would settle for a federal system in which the republics had a great deal of autonomy. They want control over natural resources, the police, and their border, including the international border. And they want, in effect, a veto power on foreign relations. I cannot see the Kiev government giving them that, but the Normandy group of Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany. France and Germany are at the moment, as we speak, putting enormous pressure on the government of Ukraine to deliver this. Can there be a deal that mixes federalism in the East with a pullback on Russian forces, neutrality for Ukraine, and the end of the crisis? Now, when I suggest this, friends of mine say, well, that is a violation of Ukrainian self-determination. I'm sorry, it's a very cruel world, and lots of countries want to have self-determination, but it cannot be abstracted from the strategic conditions in which we find ourselves. Look at the history of this country since the founding of the Republic. Many countries wanted to exercise self-determination, but when Salvador Allende was overthrown in 1973, none other than Secretary Kissinger said, just because the Chileans voted a socialist, that doesn't mean we have to expect it, right? We have to accept it. Syria, very quickly. Why did they go in? I think the Iranians, the Iraqis, and the Russians concluded that had the Russians not gone in September of last year, the Assad regime would have collapsed. Why would it have collapsed? Because the resistance had moved into two critical provinces, Aleppo province and Idlib province, sitting like this. South, there's a strip running from the coast, from Latakia to Tartus in the south. To the east, you have the Jabal al-Nusuriya mountain range. This block that I'm pointing to is the historic homeland of the Alawite minority of Bashar al-Assad. The guerrilla, the resistance, having secured these two provinces, had begun to infiltrate the coastal plain. Had they succeeded and had that corridor fallen, there would have been a massacre of Alawites. Now, the Russians are not particularly worried about massacres because they've done their share of massacring in the North Caucasus. But one has to understand that just as we have put military power down to defend our interests, we should not be surprised when other powers do this. Russia has a very, very long history and stake in Syria. The first arms deal signed with a Middle Eastern country was with Syria in 1954. The Soviet Navy won access to the port of Tartus in 1971. In 1980, with Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez, Syria and Russia signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation that had all kinds of security connotations. About 30,000 Syrian engineers and scientists and doctors received educations in the Soviet Union, and 10,000 officers were trained from the Syrian officers. They have a significant stake, and they felt that the alternative would be not the triumph of the moderates. I want to be clear about this. Not the triumph of the moderates and the secularists we're talking about, but a coalition, not ISIS, called the Army of Conquest. The Army of Conquest, which has about 25 groups in it. One is Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda front. The other is Ahrar al-Sham, which is a Salafi movement. Make no mistake, the aim of these groups is to turn Syria into a 7th century caliphate. This the Russians cannot afford to see happening for all kinds of reasons. For the life of me, I can't imagine why we would like to see it happen. Now, we say that the Russians did not target ISIS positions. They targeted Western-backed groups, like the Army of Conquest. There's a very good reason for it. ISIS was not threatening to bring down the Assad regime. The immediate problem lay in Aleppo and Idlib. That's why the targeting occurred. That's why they went in. Is it possible to have a settlement in Russia? I think Mr. Putin, having gone in, is going to find it much easier, much more difficult to get out. I think he has no illusions that there can be a regime that unifies Russia and is ruled by the Ba'athist Party to which Mr. Assad belongs. But since the Russians have gone in, Assad himself is now talking about reunifying the country and is driving the Russians insane. What do the Russians hope for? I think some kind of political settlement in which their man will come in holding a stronger hand. This is why the push for Aleppo city, which is the largest city in Syria, it's not Damascus, is going on, has been going on quite recently. I rather doubt that the ceasefire will hold. I think Syria is finished as a unified country. I think the Russians will in the end settle for a rump Ba'athist state. Can we get out of it? I think we can. I believe, and I'm not in the majority on this, that we and the Russians have a common interest in Syria not being ruled by jihadist groups. The option is not between the blood-drenched Mr. Assad, for whom I have no grief, and I'm sure none of you either, and some version of Thomas Jefferson. The folks opposing Assad on the ground with firepower and territory under their control are the kind of groups that I mentioned, plus ISIS. That is the unhappy choice that faces us. I will say one other thing. I think because of the economic crisis, Mr. Putin is looking for a way out of the mess. But there's another reason why I think he would like to mend fences with the West. Because the sanctions are certainly hurting, given the tanking of oil prices. Every Russian strategist that I have known for the last 30 years has one fear looking out 20 years. That is, will Russia be able to deal with the country that they think will be the really serious threat? It's not us, not the EU that can't decide what day of the week it is. It is China. And I think a complete rupture with the West will leave Russia at the tender mercy of the Chinese. That doesn't mean that the state we are in now, which I think Lee is correct, it's the worst crisis with Russia since the Cold War. We can climb out of this easily, but I think both sides have an interest in doing so. It's really a question of what the terms will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a number of questions that should be raised about the presentation. But I think for now, point to some of the continuity between the two presenters, which is that it's not a return to the Cold War, but dangerous. And I would say that we've heard two more or less realist presentations in terms of how Russia assesses its interests and how the United States ought to assess its interest by contrast. So we've heard about the perspective from the United States, the perspective from Russia, and now Professor Jason Davidson will give us the varied perspectives from Europe. Professor Davidson is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the University of Mary Washington, and among other things is the author of The Origins of Revisionist and Status Quo States. So, Jason, the floor is yours.
Great. So I do have some slides that I'm going to run through here. There we go. Go back just a second. So what I want to say, first of all, thank you, Ambassador Feinstein, and thank you, Professor Ganguly, and everyone else involved for inviting me, bringing me here. So back over the summer, I got an email from Tim Holly, actually, and it said, we'd like you to come to Indiana, and we want you to talk about the European perspective on whether there's a new Cold War emerging between the West and Russia over Ukraine. And I actually laughed out loud. Like, the European perspective. There is no European perspective on anything. Not the European. There is no a European perspective on anything. Right? We got 28 countries in the European Union. Incredible variety in terms of geography, in terms of economy, in terms of history. They can't come up with really solid common policies on really important things like austerity and migration, right? I think it's actually really kind of impressive that they have the coherence in terms of the issue we're about to talk about that they have. But what I'm going to talk about is that the consensus that does exist is very fragile. And that we've got three basic groups of people. At least I'm going to group three basic types of countries in terms of this particular issue. So that's what I want to talk about. I'm going to be very quick on this because we heard about much of it from Ambassador Feinstein. The one thing that he didn't talk about quite as much was some of the NATO things below. So in addition to the sanctions, I guess the other thing that I just briefly mentioned in terms of the sanctions is that the sanctions really start after the annexation of Crimea, and then they really take off for the European Union in the context of the Malaysia 17 aircraft grounding. We spent a lot of time on that, but it's amazing because I've been doing some research on this, and what you see is how, for even skeptical countries like Italy, in the period of a few days of both the annexation itself and then very much after that crash, the tone changes completely. And people who were before saying sanctions not such a good idea, we really shouldn't do this, they're just quiet all of a sudden. And that's when the consensus develops to move forward. Also really interesting just to keep in mind in terms of where we are today, now whenever you see reference to the EU sanctions, they're talking about Minsk II. They're talking about a peace agreement that did not exist at the time that they created the sanction. And they're basically saying, if you comply with all these things in Minsk II, then we'll lift these sanctions. Well, those things didn't have to do with why they created the sanctions in the first place. Just worth mentioning. This 2% spending pledge at the Wales Summit, not terribly important. I think worth mentioning. I think there are some countries that really said, yes, we'll give it a try. But for the most part, kind of an empty pledge, even though it's not part of the headlines. Now, the Spearhead Rapid Reaction Force, 4,000 to 5,000 troops. NATO had a rapid reaction force, has a rapid reaction force, a larger force that was designed to be mobilized, and they called it rapid reaction, in a week's time, roughly. This new force is supposed to be able to get somewhere in 48 hours. The most recent Obama administration announcement is for a U.S. armed combat brigade that will be posted in Central and Eastern Europe and just be rotating around. We won't have a permanent location, but that's a big part of what NATO is going to be doing moving forward in terms of this. We'll see how permanent those things are. So I'm going to talk about three groups of countries here. What I'm going to refer to as the hardline countries, kind of countries in the middle, and then softline countries. Each of the countries I'm going to talk about three things, some examples of who they are, not necessarily exhaustive, what that means for them to be hardline, what am I talking about, and then finally, why. So first of all, the hardline countries are the Balts, the three Baltic countries, Poland, and the UK. That's pretty much an exhaustive list. These are the countries that you always hear about being very firm in terms of, from the beginning, we should have sanctions, or today, we should keep sanctions firmly in place. These are the countries that are in favor of a firmer NATO response. So, for example, Poland would love to have permanent NATO troops stationed in their territory. The Baltic countries would love that as well. So those kinds of positions. Now, why? Well, it's pretty obvious. It's the neighborhood, right? It's all about location, location, location. So we're going to look at a map in just a second. But this is a big part of the threat that these countries perceive. The other is for the Baltic countries, neighborhood and history, right? And then for the Baltic countries, it's their Russian ethnic minority population. We'll talk about that in just a second. But then one thing I wanted to mention before I move on to the map is Britain, which is an interesting addition to this list. They've also been very firm in all these things. Why? They're not particularly threatened. They have a nuclear deterrent. In their perspective, NATO is their security lifeline, and NATO's credibility is incredibly important. And they want to hew as close to the hardest line of NATO that they can, because they want to preserve that credible part of their security. So here, for people who don't have this, I know you guys are almost all experts, so you might not need this, but just in case, this gives you a sense of the four countries bordering on either Russia proper or Kaliningrad. And then nice up here, you see this is the percentage of their population that consists of the ethnic Russian minorities. We could talk and definitely defer to Professor Menon on Russia expertise, but recall that in April 2014, Putin started talking about the Russian world and defending Russian speakers. And, you know, I think it's reasonable, let's put it this way, for folks in the Baltic states to be a little concerned. So this is an interesting graph. So this is percent of spending change, percentage change in defense spending from 2014 to 2015. So reaction to events in Ukraine, perhaps, right? 2014 spending already in when the crisis happened. And I don't know what's going on in Luxembourg. Otherwise, it's just kind of like what we would expect. Really puzzled, but don't have anyone to ask. You can't quite see the numbers here, so I apologize for the print's a little bit small. But this is a poll that got a lot of press this past summer, and they asked people about whether Russia was a threat or not. They asked some other questions, but I thought this particular question was interesting in terms of what we're talking about here. So you see Poland, 70% of people saying that Russia is a threat, not just to Ukraine, but to countries around it. Really striking. Spain, on the other hand, only 49% having that view. Germany, 38%. Right? We'll talk about why that might be the case, but my point is being, the lower your perception of threat, all things held equal, the less, you know, hardline you're going to be on the sanctions and on the NATO position. Then you've got countries that I'm going to refer to as kind of conflicted countries, countries in the middle. These countries, on the one hand, have so far voted in favor of sanctions. They sometimes say we need to keep sanctions in place, and I think for the most part, countries in this category are saying that. However, they also will do some things and say some things a little bit on more favoring of dialogue and more reaching out to Russia. So, and there's a mix here. So first of all, they don't see Russia as a security threat, right? So I mentioned before, Germany, only 38% of Germans. And I think if you looked at the German elite, you would have a similar perspective. They would have a similar perspective. They don't see Russia as a direct security threat. They do, however, have economic ties. And I'm talking about this more really with the soft line countries, but for now, let's just say that one of the important things about the sanctions, and now I'm forgetting if Master President mentioned this or not, but a really important thing with the sanctions for my story is the counter-sanctions. So the EU extended these sanctions, you know, asset freezes, travel bans, freezes on dual-use technologies, all these sorts of things. And Russia said, oh yeah? Well, we're going to put sanctions on EU agricultural imports into Russia, right? And we're in Indiana, so you got farmers. What do we know about farmers? Well, not as politically powerful as they used to be, perhaps, but they're still politically powerful in those places. Very powerful in most of the EU countries. Very powerful. They're powerful, right? They can make their voices heard. They care, right? It's basically their livelihood. So when I was in Germany over the summer, I was talking to a colleague about, you know, why is Germany even wavering at all on this? Like, why don't they have a much harder line on this issue with Russia? And my friend starts rifling off these statistics about German dairy. And I had no idea that there apparently was a really intense German dairy relationship with Russia prior to these sanctions coming into place. And so now you've got all these dairy farmers in Germany who are complaining about Russia. We've got a domestic focus in general because of the economic, sort of continued economic troubles in European Union area. Final thing I want to talk about in terms of these conflicted countries, I think in particular, and for those of you who are really interested in Germany, this will make a lot of sense. What we have seen in the post-Cold War period, or excuse me, starting in the Cold War, but definitely moving into the post-Cold War period, is a really strong set of beliefs about norms, particularly in Western Europe. And sometimes it doesn't always filter through to the United States, right? But a really strong idea that the international system should be run according to international law, and countries should comply with international norms, and this is the way things should be, right? And the Germans in particular really, you know, I think most Germans, both at the public level and at the elite level, really get this. for them to see something like a country to annex another country's territory is pretty shocking from a normative perspective. So Merkel, yes, she goes to the World War II 70th anniversary celebrations in Russia. I mean, going itself was a bit controversial, but while she's there, she refers publicly. She refers to the criminal and illegal annexation of the Crimea. Now, apparently, somebody's nodding who knows this. Apparently, in the translation, they excised the word criminal. So they're like, we're okay with illegal, but criminal not so much. In the local press, but I do think that's part of why some of these conflicted countries are still in favor of sanctions, even though they otherwise aren't. It's not in their national interest. It's not in their domestic public's preferences and interests, but they do feel pulled by international norms. Oh, okay. Well, that's not going to show up too well then. I'm just going to give you the. You know what? We'll just run through this, and I'll give you the quick and dirty here, which is that the Baltic countries have a lot of trade with. This is the CIS. I'm using it as a proxy because I couldn't get all the complete data for Russia for all the countries. But the Baltic countries have the most economic relationship with Russia, and if you look at the individual statistics for Russia for these countries, you'll see that by far they have the greatest economic relationship. So clearly they're not being motivated by economics. Most of the countries that are screaming the loudest actually have lower exports and imports from Russia. So your Italy's, your Greece's is an exception, and that's part of the reason why they're screaming loud. But you know, security, I think this is one of the lessons here. That what you see is sometimes people will sell you, I apologize for the term here, but the snake oil, that trade is going to make, you know, trade can make security concerns go away. Well, Baltic countries are, you know, they're trading a lot with Russia, and they're still in favor of a very firm response. Right? It's not making their concerns going away. It's more the countries that are kind of in the middle that can see this out of the way that are more persuaded by the trade issues. So these soft line countries, Italy, Greece, Slovenia. I'll just say a couple things here very quickly and then wrap up. Greece. So apparently, prior to sanctions, 60% of Greek peach exports went to Russia. 90% of their strawberry exports went to Russia. So go back to what I said before. 90% of the strawberry exports. Those strawberry farmers, right, they're going to be complaining. And that's a part of why the Greek government is open to and has made statements saying, sanctions not such a good idea. Now, so far, the only thing that really has happened in terms of anything other than statements, the only thing procedural that's happened is Italy in mid-December voted to force debate on EU sanctions. So rather than just an automatic renewal, you know, just sort of fold it over because the sanctions are on a 6-month renewal clock. So rather than just an automatic holdover, the Italian representative actually forced debate on the issue. I think that's a huge part of that is Italy's agricultural relationship with Russia. There's a lot of stuff in the press about and folks being very concerned that it's not just about loss of sales in the short term. There's some EU help, subsidies to help with that, but rather the long term being displaced from this market that they find very valuable. But then we've also got low threat from these countries. These are countries that are far away from Russia, and they don't see Russia as having any sort of thing to do with their potential security issues. I'm not going to go into this because we're trying to be as quick as possible, but what I will say about the way the Russian intervention in Syria affects the European equation is that whether the Russians intended to use Syria as leverage to end sanctions, it's not working out that way. That is, some of the kind of moderate countries, I think France is a perfect example. France conceivably, had the Russians done what they said they were going to do, and just gone after ISIS, I think they could have won France over, and that conceivably would have been a vote to end sanctions. And France is a big player in terms of this. But by going after everyone, essentially, every opponent of the Assad regime, they have made countries like France if anything, now they've got even more concerned with Russia than they had before. So just to wrap up, I don't think we're moving to a new Cold War from the European perspective, and I think if the United States wants to move in favor of a new Cold War, it won't have for very long European allies in that direction. If I had to bet, I would say definitely not this coming time, but maybe within the next few years we'll start to see sanctions erode and ultimately dissolve altogether. And relations, at least between most of the European countries and Russia, will be back to normal.
Thank you very much. And I think Professor Davidson was quite accurate to focus on the really pivotal role of Angela Merkel, because without her support for sanctions, it's unlikely that Europe would have agreed to not only go along with what the U.S. proposal was on sanctions, but actually impose more extensive sanctions than the United States has, and to sustain them until this point. All right, well, our last panelist is our commentator, Professor Dina Speckler, who many of you already know, Professor of Political Science here in Bloomington, scholar of Russian and comparative foreign policy, as well as politics and foreign policy in the Middle East. Her most recent research focuses on Russian policymaking in Central Asia, and Professor Speckler will give us her perspective on what constitutes or doesn't a return to the Cold War, and also any feedback you might have from our other speakers. Professor Speckler.
Thank you. I thought I'd develop a little bit some of the insights that we've had already and address this question of what do we mean when we talk about the Cold War before we can proceed to ask, is there one or isn't there one? I think it's important to emphasize that the Cold War was a unique moment in history, really unprecedented, involving a relationship with extraordinarily intense, sustained hostility, not merely between two rival states, but between two entire alliance systems. Yet this relationship had very distinctive cognitive, behavioral, situational, or structural characteristics. On the cognitive side, and this has been alluded to here, there was deep ideological antagonism as well as competition for power. There was profound mutual suspicion of the intentions of the other side, and the assumption by each side that the other sought complete destruction of its social, economic, and political system. There was a mutual perception of a complete or nearly complete zero-sum game being played by both sides. That is, each side felt that any gain for the other was a loss to itself. And there was a complete preoccupation with the conflict. All foreign policy issues, barring none, really, were seen on both sides in terms of the impact that they were likely to have on the course of the Cold War. Behaviorally, and we have had an allusion to this today, there was near total mobilization of societal and governmental effort and resources on both sides for the purpose of prosecuting this conflict. Very, very large governmental expenditures devoted to that effort. And there was a quest on both sides to secure not merely territory, allies, resources, but also popular allegiance, both at home and abroad. This was a big part of the effort. Hearts and minds, we used to call it. And there was a use of a vast array of techniques to wage this Cold War, involving the exercise of both hard and soft power, military assets, economic levers, coercive diplomacy, espionage, cultural exchanges, propaganda, aimed at both internal and external audiences. And it's already been said, and it's important to add, that this conflict was global in scope. Virtually all international actors were highly affected by it. And there was a constant testing of the willingness of both sides to respond to behavior that was perceived to be provocative. It's been mentioned that there were massive troop deployments, both conventional and nuclear. And at the same time, though, there were similar self-imposed restraints by both sides on their own conduct of the war. The avoidance of direct confrontation, the use of proxies, and the avoidance, of course, of what's come to be called the escalation to extremes, using those most destructive weapons in the arsenals of both sides. Situationally, what was characteristic of the Cold War, or structurally, was the ability of the alliance leaders, very different as we've seen from today, on both sides to call the shots, to determine to a very substantial degree alliance policies toward the other side. An extreme polarization of the international system. Very few actors in that system succeeded in remaining neutral. Okay, so let's compare. Do we have something similar? Do we have something different? Definitely, there are a lot of differences today, and I think all of our panelists have emphasized those differences, and I will rehearse a few and add a few. First of all, and these differences definitely do serve to limit the degree of hostility between the two sides. And the differences between then and now reduce the dangers inherent in the situation. And they create opportunities for interaction, even joint action, to address a variety of international problems and issues. So what are these differences? Well, first of all, it's been said, and I think Dean Feinstein mentioned, while there are major disagreements between Washington and Moscow on a variety of basic policy issues, the proper limits on the power of the state, the political rights of citizens, the legitimacy of external intervention to secure the rights of citizens and protect populations of other states from violence and from oppression. Still, the ideological divide is a lot less deep today. Both sides readily acknowledge the existence of an array of important common interests and the need to cooperate to promote them. And the degree of economic interdependence, as we've just heard so ably with regard to Europe, is far greater today, especially between Europe and Russia, than at any point during the Cold War. Today, neither side attaches much probability to the notion that an all-out military clash is going to occur between them in the near future, very different from the Cold War situation. And accordingly, both have drastically reduced deployments of conventional armed forces in Europe and slashed strategic arsenals. The forces that are deployed are not on hair-trigger alert, poised for launching at a moment's notice. And neither government shapes its policies on every subject everywhere on the globe in terms of the probable impact of those policies on the East-West relationship. And most governments outside Europe and the Middle East, and even some governments in those regions, are not profoundly affected by rising tensions between East and West, or between Russia and members of the Atlantic Alliance. Many, if not most, governments around the world are on reasonably good terms with both the United States and Russia and don't feel compelled to align with one or the other. Moreover, it's certainly not accurate to suggest that there's now a rigid East-West divide in the contemporary international system, certainly not two opposing blocs or alliance systems. Not only is NATO a far looser organization, with far less policy coordination and far more actors involved in policy formulation than during the Cold War. There really is no Eastern counterpart to NATO. Moscow has been trying valiantly for some time to construct one, but has very little success in that area. So these differences are very important, and you do need to keep them in mind. And I join my colleagues in thinking that one has to keep them in mind in thinking about the current situation. I think my views are a little bit darker and more pessimistic, though, because I think there's some important similarities and growing similarities that have begun to emerge. With Professor Davidson, I share the notion that, I don't know if an attack route or a root cause, but that some of those similarities began to emerge by the late 1990s. Although Western leaders were generally unaware of or didn't publicly acknowledge or actively deny the similarities. In other words, there were behaviors on the American side and the Western side that were characteristic of the Cold War. And these definitely included the enlargement of NATO. And I think from a Russian perspective, even that first round of enlargement of NATO was not benign. However, we may have thought that it might have been. And then certainly the inclusion of countries that had been part of the Soviet Union itself in 2004 was most definitely not viewed as benign by the Russians. In fact, it was viewed as a challenge to vital Russian interests. Another challenge to vital Russian interests has been active Western support, both governmental and non-governmental, on the part of the West to encourage regime change in countries that Moscow considered important allies, like Serbia, or had even been part of the Soviet Union, like Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. And the result has been establishment of governments either for closer relations with the West, even membership in NATO, in countries that the Russians regard as their privileged sphere of influence. These Western actions generated perceptions, assumptions, and behaviors on the Russian side that were likewise characteristic of the Cold War period. By the mid-2000s, the leadership in the Kremlin concluded that Western governments were actively trying to undermine Russia's power, bolster a manifestly anti-Russian alliance, deny Russia a vital sphere of influence, and ultimately transform political systems not merely of countries in its sphere of influence, but transform the Russian political system as well. And since that time, the Russian government has been taking systematic steps to curtail the spread of Western ideas and suppress political activity that, in its view, could lead to regime change in the Russian Federation. It's also been waging what one scholar has called a concerted propaganda war at home and abroad to rebut Western criticisms and project a favorable image of the Russian Federation to mass audiences. This is all very Cold War-like behavior. During this period, Russia has halted compliance with a path-breaking post-Cold War agreement to limit threatening military deployments in Europe. It has suspended cooperation with NATO. It has threatened an attack on NATO members. It has twice employed overt military force to ensure that no more neighboring states would gravitate into the embrace of the West. And it has undertaken a major military spending and modernization program that's been aimed at enabling Russia both to deter Western aggression and to project power abroad to neighboring states and beyond. So while these Cold War-like moves and counter-moves have been underway for some time, in some cases for more than a decade and a half, there's no question, and here I agree with the panelists, that a major turning point occurred in Russia's relations with the West, almost exactly two years ago today. And since then, there's been a marked deterioration of those relations, and the emergence of a situation with even more Cold War-like features. And of course, I have in mind the entrance into Crimea of heavily armed men in unlabeled green military uniforms that set up military checkpoints, seize government buildings, and transportation hubs. Since then, and I will only use 3 more minutes here, there have been a lot of changes. First of all, I think there have been more symmetrical now and more enhanced threat perceptions. For more than a decade now, Moscow has regarded the West, especially Washington, particularly Washington, as an unalterable antagonist. But few governments in the West have viewed Russia in those terms, and I think some are beginning to do so. Until that time, Western leaders like Angela Merkel and Barack Obama were confident that the Cold War had ended, that, as they put it, the zero-sum geopolitics of hard power no longer had any place in Europe, that Russian-Western tensions were transient and could be reset. And I think that conviction is beginning to diminish and may have disappeared entirely. There's definitely intensified mutual mistrust, accompanying these newly mutual perceptions of a more lasting enmity. Each side is accusing the other of violating a historic 1987 treaty slashing intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe. Russia's new military doctrine, published at the end of December last year, warns of a conventional attack by NATO that threatens the very existence of Russia. And the new head of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff has said that Russia is the #1 threat to American national security. The competition between East and West is becoming increasingly militarized. Russian submarines are again probing coastal waters in the Baltic and around Norway. Nuclear-capable Bear bombers are regularly intercepted by NATO planes over the Baltic, just like the 1970s, 1980s. NATO defense budgets are grudgingly and slowly but rising. NATO's conventional forces in Eastern and Central Europe are being strengthened. NATO's rapid reaction capability is being increased, as is that of Russia. Ukraine, for all that NATO may be reluctant to embrace it, has now abandoned non-aligned status and may well be submitting a formal request to join NATO. And the United States has extended more than $350 million in military aid to Ukraine. We have retaliatory economic measures in place that have been talked about a lot, and competitive military engagements. Once again, the third world, or at least the Middle East, is becoming the locus of proxy warfare between the two sides. And this is dangerous now, as it was in the past, because of the possibility of escalation and the difficulty of controlling the actions of one's allies. I don't want to take extra time. Perhaps in the discussion we can talk about some of the factors that are likely to constrain these troubling developments from emerging into a full-fledged Cold War.
That was grim, but let's please applaud. Really a terrific conversation, basis for conversation in about 15 minutes in which to have it. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and I'll start over here. And if you just stand up and tell us who you are, and if you can keep your questions brief so we can get as many folks involved as possible.
Hi, Mike Biggs. I was wondering what your thoughts were on this. I read some analysis which say unless oil shoots up, which we don't think it's going to because Iran's fully getting into the game, and unless we drop the sanctions very quickly, Putin's got about a year left as Russia burns through its reserves. Just purely economic thing. They're gonna that he'll lose his power, and the other oligarchs will come in, and that they'll have to be made change because Russia will be completely out of the reserves. What do you think?
All right, I'm going to take one more question, and just to get as many people as we can
Yes.
in the conversation.
Hello, my name is David Keppel. I'd like to ask you to comment on the new U.S. nuclear weapons or modernization, in particular the new scalable warhead to go on a cruise missile. Do you see this as increasing the risk of unintentional nuclear war with Russia? And secondly, I'd like to prod you into the presidential debate that we're having here, where most of the candidates are running to the right of the Obama administration. Do you see a toughening in a U.S. position as favorable or unfavorable to stability?
All right, so let's do the question first about Putin's hold on power. The question went to the issue of his ability to manage the oligarchs, which is a pretty sophisticated way of thinking about it. I think some people also think about protests about constraints on civil society as well. But any panelists want to take a stab at Putin's? The prognosis was he had one more year unless oil and gas prices go up.
So I'll try to answer your question, but I can't give you a definitive answer because the answer is I don't know. The ruble about a year ago was trading at 35 to a dollar. It's now 75 to a dollar. For that and other reasons, the Russians have burned through a significant amount of their foreign exchange reserves. In the last quarter or so, actually, there's an uptick for reasons that I don't quite understand. Budget revenues are very oil and gas sensitive. I think I mentioned this. So we can stipulate one thing, that on the economic front, things are not going well. The economy is contracting. And you can offer your citizenry a lot of circus, but unless, like the Romans, you also add bread, you have a problem. And Mr. Putin is aware of this. But I would caution you, not that you're saying, but I'd caution the analogy between economic decline and political revolution, because if you use that indicator, economy is not going well, as a predictor for political change, you would have a lot more political upheaval in the world, in places like North Korea, for example, right? So I think the question really is, what are the ways in which the regime can manage potential dissent? And here it has something working in its favor. So far, both Western polls and Russian polls show that our view that it's a small coterie of people who are doing these terrible things and they have no social purchase is wrong. The regime has, whether we like it or not, a social basis. This I can tell you from personal observation, talking to my Russian friends, reading the Russian press, any which way. I think it's a great mistake to think that this is not a regime with a social base. I would make the same argument about Assad's regime. That's number one. The second is that they have a monopoly over information. And the third is that the opposition is very badly fragmented. Now, my friend Alex Model, who's been writing, maybe you've been reading this, Goodbye Mr. Putin, next Tuesday Mr. Putin will collapse, and if you keep saying it long enough, at some point he will die, and Alex will be proven correct. But I'm rather skeptical. And let me also add, it's not necessarily desirable to have instability in a country like Russia. 11 time zones, 147 million people, 1,500 something nuclear warheads. The idea that that would be somehow a benign process, I think beggars belief. So the answer to your question is, I would be surprised to see the collapse of the regime. I think they are in a very serious situation already, which is why I think that on the two conflicts that I mentioned, there's possibility for movement, all other things being equal, which they never are.
I would hazard any kind of prediction, and I couldn't take seriously something about a year. But the truth underlying that Putin is under increasing pressure, and that the level of political protest is rising, is significant. But I would also, I agree that Putin has tremendous popularity at home, and there are a couple of things that he can do. I mentioned in my own comments a major military modernization program. Number one, that's actually beginning to near completion, and the possibility of shifting resources from defense expenditures to consumption or welfare as needed is there, and that's a cushion that he has available that he can use. And I would also emphasize, on the other hand, my comment thrusts a little the opposite way from Professor Menon's, and that is that Russians, I think, are increasingly accepting the notion of a threat from the West. And that's producing what very often a threat perception does produce in a polity, namely a kind of rallying around the flag and rallying around the leader. And I think, although on balance sanctions are bad for Russia, on the other hand, sanctions have enabled Russia or Putin to make the argument that we really are under siege, that we really are not welcome over there, that intentions over there are hostile. And I think there's some play and possibility for play in that in terms of helping to strengthen and stabilize Putin's position.
All right, and continuing on that, but also getting to our second question, does anybody want to take on the issue of, as well, developments in U.S. defense spending, nuclear modernization, and the impact of the presidential campaign on the current circumstances?
I was going to say a few words on the campaign. I find it fascinating. So, we've been here for quite some time now, and nobody's mentioned Donald Trump. So I'll be the first to do so. He said some really interesting things. I mean, obviously nobody pays attention to what he said about Ukraine, but he said some interesting things about Ukraine. What he's basically said about Ukraine is that's the Europeans' problem. Why do we have anything to do with it? He's been on record in the past of saying, and that's during this campaign cycle, right? This is an interview transcript. He's been on record in the past of saying that that NATO is basically a bunch of freeloaders, And we should, the same interview that I mentioned before that took place over the summer, Trump said, with regard to the South Korean alliance, that we should force the South Koreans to essentially pay us for protection, sort of extortion, right? And it's conceivable that he has similar ideas with regard to NATO. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I don't think Donald Trump's position on this issue is at all more assertive than the Obama administration's.
Right.
Now, for the other two leading Republican nominees, definitely. Now, what that would mean in practice is a whole other question.
Yes.
Right? And I suspect that a Cruz, Rubio, or Clinton policy on this issue would be rather similar. That we would actually get sort of similar outcomes from those three.
And
It's
tougher
Trump
than-
that would be, and again, who knows what's going to transpire. But that's of the possible candidates, that's the one that would be very different.
Indeed.
Sean, did you want to weigh in?
On the election, the place where I see the actual biggest risk, and again, hopefully things would de-escalate in Syria with time here, but this idea of no-fly zone on Syria, I think, is potentially incredibly reckless and dangerous. With Russian planes flying around, not only, no-fly zone, it sounds like an easy thing to do, it's actually not. You've got to take out a lot of defense systems and so on and so forth. And if you're going to protect people in locations, you also need people, frankly, on the ground.
Yeah.
So to spot. And we found that out, like in Sarajevo, for example. You have to have perimeter defense, not just immediate defense. And so I'm kind of frankly surprised that some people who spent a lot of time understanding the Balkans have not understood this kind of dynamic with regard to Syria. But we saw it, for example, when Paul turned to Chris Christie and said, well, if you want the guy to start World War III, you should vote for him.
Yes.
Right? And I think the problem, let me say one thing really quick on the nukes and the modernization. I'm not an expert on it, so I'll be careful here. There are things in our nuclear arsenal that do need to be modernized, but a big part of it is that I do believe this was part of a deal that had to be struck to get the last START treaty approved, and that was a treaty that should have been approved as a no-brainer and shouldn't have required any of this stuff. So whether we need to modernize or not, that's maybe a separate question, but there are other things that have lagged. For example, we've seen virtually the end of non-leader threat reduction cooperation program, which was one of the most successful disarmament programs in history. So that's the kind of thing that has suffered, I think, as a result too of these growing tensions with time. The last thing I think I'd say here on the defense dynamics here, we have an alliance already with two nuclear powers in Europe. We have 2 million people in uniform in Europe. Russia spends about 60 to 80, check me if I'm wrong here, Charles, depends what we're measuring, but billions of dollars on defense relative to it. Any reasonable, the problem is Russia has escalation dominance in its immediate vicinity. And that could include the Baltic countries. And, that's where it could get really dicey very quickly. So the danger isn't that two countries here want to go into like a game of chicken on nuclear, but there is a risk of escalation scenarios that where Russia, for example, if it was losing somewhere even, might start using nuclear weapons. So if you vary, I can't even begin to restate how significant the question is that you raised, because we're talking, every presidential candidate is going to have to say, or at least should be asked, what is your sense of this question of nuclear weapons as regards to U.S.-Russia relations, and how do you see a progressive and satisfactory relationship going forward? I think so far we have been able to decouple things like that from the root issue of Ukraine. But there are too many places where a small little incident could lead to something that escalates. And in the immediate vicinity, they do have escalation dominance. which is another reason, even if we could make a difference with arming Ukraine, for example, by the time we even got them there and equipped and trained and everything else, that would have incentivized the Russians to move even further into Ukraine. There's literally nothing we can do about it. It's a dangerous, false promise to the Ukrainians we say we aspire to help. So that's where, again, restraint, I think, really requires being applied here, and I do think it's been applied. Now, you're right that the dominant political trends do kind of reflect either this neoconservative emphasis or this sort of liberal order-building emphasis that we've seen for 20 years. That's going to require probably some adjustments as we begin to think not only about the Russians, but as you say, about the Europeans and where they're going. And the only other thing I'd add to your point, by the way, is about energy, of course, and natural gas dependency, and so on and so forth, which also factors in.
Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in more questions if there are any. Yes, please.
My name's Peter. I was wondering what you guys think about the rise of the nationalist movements in Europe, the far right. How does that affect the relationship?
That's an excellent question. Are there any other questions? People here. My last chance. Okay, so it's an important question about the rise of nationalism, its sources, what people think about it, and we'll also use this as an opportunity for our panelists to make any closing remarks they'd like. So why don't we go in reverse order, and we'll start with Professor Specker.
I think the rising nationalism in Europe is troubling. I don't think it's troubling from the point of view of a new Cold War. I don't think it's going to make a major impact in terms of any kind of East-West confrontation of that sort. And in fact, there are even nationalist forces in Europe that are actually friendly with Russia and friendly with Putin, paradoxically. And so I'm not worried about it from that point of view. I'm certainly concerned about it in terms of what it means for the future of Europe and the future of European societies. And there, I think it's troubling, and I don't have any special insights as to whether this is a wave of the future that is likely to develop. My hunch is that it is, and that this current immigration crisis has really, really fueled that and spread discontent with the liberal order throughout Europe that the nationalists in Europe are feeling.
Well, I guess the one thing that I can say most directly to the point, the question about nationalism, is that there have been pretty extensive and reliable reports at this point that the Russian government is supporting a lot of these groups. Really, yeah. So the National Front in France, just one example, but there are a number of examples. These are groups that are also, so in general, even though this is counterintuitive, these movements and parties are in favor of better relations with Russia, right? That's counterintuitive because you would think, like, here's a country who's acting aggressive near you. If you're a nationalist, you should be, but that's what they're favoring.
It's a Russian strategy.
All right. And they're also, the one way that it applies also, or another way that it applies is that they also have a tendency to be very Eurosceptic, right? So they're pushing back against the EU in general, and they're seeing EU sanctions as sort of a Brussels thing, or something that their country gets bound into, but it's not really there. I guess I use this as a really quick opportunity to mention too, I thought somebody might ask about Brexit and the consequences that would have. Well, and just in case people aren't following it, this is something that very, very well could happen, right? If it happens, well, go back to my hardline countries. -1. And not just -1, but minus the biggest, most powerful of the hardline countries. So sanctions erosion looks a lot more likely if you no longer have Britain in the European Union. I guess I'll end there rather than making summary. Oh, the one thing I guess I was going to say is on oil and gas, absolutely agree. And I was going to talk more about, there's a backstory, I'm sure nobody knows, but I'll just mention it. There's a backstory in terms of the Italian issue of the South Stream versus North Stream pipelines. One that was the Russians canceled because Brussels was throwing up regulatory obstacles, and the Italian oil company Eni had an interest in that, whereas Brussels has been far more cooperative with the German-backed Nord Stream 2 project, and so it's still going forward. And so the Italians are very much irritated. But of course, oil and gas, very important in terms of that relationship. And one good reason why the Europeans are unlikely to shift in favor of a really hardline stance against Russia moving forward.
I have no lead there.
Okay.
I won't say too much about the nationalism stuff. I think we got plenty of it from Donald Trump at this point, so I won't add too much more. It is interesting. I think there's some, this kind of idea of Putinism, is a tactic for domestic power, and so I see Orban doing it, and to a degree Trump also reinforcing this idea, for example, of scary outside threats, but in his opinion, but for example, banning Muslims or whatever, which is of course outrageous. But I want to answer that very quickly in a way that, so if you think about the three layers here in Europe, one Cold War classic Russian strategy was always to try to either decouple the US from the Allies or to divide and conquer, in effect, the Allies. And this is one place where they may have firm ground, because institutions are institutions, but states have interests, right? And some of the southern, more southeastern European countries have been much less ambitious about wanting, even with more trade relations and so forth, like Romania and Bulgaria. So the dilemma here is that because, like, for example, NATO and the EU on sanctions work by consensus, that they can cherry pick off countries that might, be more amenable to the Russian position. Okay, so I know that people in UCOM and U.S. defense plans say, well, this is for the one thing that they think Russia may have some strategic thinking on. How can we create lever disagreements between the U.S. and the Allies? And the reason why that's so important is because after 60 plus years of Cold War, the United States does need more burden sharing from its allies. It does need Europe to step up. I'm more optimistic on the European equation. Actually, I'm one who thinks the biggest threat to European security today remains the Eurozone problem and the Euro itself. I think in terms of stability and nationalism and other things, that's still working at a slow motion train wreck instead of a... But either way, just to make this point very quickly, the depth of the economic crisis in Europe really can't be understated. So how do they get more burden sharing? Well, they need better pooling of their resources. The U.S. presence in the reassurance initiative in Eastern Europe is very small. We're not talking about a large mobilization. And the reason it's rotational is because we did agree with the Russians we wouldn't put permanent bases in these countries and we enlarged NATO. That was one of the gains they made along with the Permanent Joint Council, joining the G8. That's what I meant when they, wasn't that it was benign from their view, but they did take advantage of it. Or, in fact, in some ways, they created a scenario where they could get sweeteners in the process that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten.
Well, they had no choice.
Yeah, well, true enough, yeah, to be sure. But the bottom line is, as the U.S. looks at the world, it does need its most capable and financially capable and military capable European allies to take primary responsibility for their security, backstopped and supported by the United States. And the reason for that is because we also have this pivot to China that we've got to deal with. We've got this trade deal on the Pacific that could falter, and so on. And so, we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time here, including deal with the Persian Gulf and rising states like India and so forth, how we're going to engage constructively, and so on. So we really actually need the Europeans to be out front on this one. And I'm going to make that point and still not align with Donald Trump in the process.
Well, the Donald is right there on your back screen.
Yeah.
And what I'm impressed by in this extremely good discussion is how interconnected are all of these issues. So the incursion into Ukraine, the response that it created within the EU, the impact of the refugee crisis, the most serious since World War II, on European cohesion, and the interconnectedness of Russian actions in Syria, whether it's intensifying conflict or supporting a ceasefire, has on the European public and nationalism and xenophobia, and what all of that means for the United States. So with that, please join me in thanking all of our panelists.